Awesome. And we are live. Hello, live with Astronomer attendees. You're back for a very special Live with Astronomer, where we'll actually be going into one of the newest features, Airflow in Airflow 2.7, which is setup and teardown tasks. And here to talk about it, after I give you a quick demo, is one of the men behind the magic, Daniel Standish. So Daniel, if you want to just quick introduce yourself, just so everyone knows who you are.
Yeah, I'm Daniel Standish. I've been committing to Airflow for since I guess 2018, and yeah, I'm part of the open source team at Astronomer.
Awesome, thank you, Daniel. So we'll hear a lot more about what that open source team does in a second, but just first to set the stage, in case you weren't on the 2.7 release Live with Astronomer, here I have for you just a quick example of what we're going to be talking about, which are setup and teardown tasks. So setup and teardown tasks are essentially tasks that have a special trigger rule in that they will always run no matter if any task before it has failed. And the reason this is really great is for situations where, hey, I want to provision a resource just for the purposes of this specific pipeline. So maybe that's an ML cluster. In this example, it's just a temp table that I'm creating within Snowflake to run some data quality checks on my data in there, and then deleting that temp table so I'm not paying for storage of data that I'm not actually using after it's been moved into production. And so a typical problem with implementing this kind of workflow with data quality checks is that if one of those data quality checks failed, then the delete action would be skipped, and so the temp table wouldn't be deleted. So you can see here with setup teardown task, you can see the relationship defined by this setup task here, and then it's linked to a dotted line to this teardown task here. So this teardown task will always run as long as the setup task has run. And you can also have multiple setup tasks that all have to run for that teardown task to run. And so even as you can see here, this is a use case where, hey, these data quality checks passed. So we do want to load it in production and we want to delete that temp table. But let's say one of those data quality checks failed. Well, then what we're going to do is actually not load it in production, and we're still going to delete that temp table so we don't just have that bad data sitting there. And that is what setup and teardown tasks are in a really basic nutshell. And now I will kick it over, and we're going to switch over to more of a little fireside chat with my man Daniel around how he designed it, some of the considerations, and just giving us a general overview of why this was made possible by some of the recent changes within Airflow. So got a quick introduction on you. Maybe you could just quick tell us, how long you've been contributing for, and then bring us in a little explainer about what setup and teardown tasks are to you. You're on mute, Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, so I got involved with Airflow when I was starting working on a data integration project, like ingesting a lot of media spend sources and that sort of thing. And then, one of the cool things about Airflow is that the skills that you need to sort of use it are very similar to the skills that you need to contribute to it. And so pretty early on, I started contributing, and it's just been a fun process. Yeah.
Amazing. It's awesome to hear. Yeah, I hope it inspires more people to get into contributing to Airflow. So maybe you can tell us now a little bit more about what setup teardown tasks are, just from maybe more of a technical standpoint than my kind of high level approach.
Yeah. So the way I think about it is sort of like separating work from infra, and so the typical example of that is like, let's say you have a query that needs a cluster, like a query that needs some kind of compute or something to submit it against. Before you run that query, you want to spin up the cluster, and then after the query runs, you want to tear it down. And there's basically two kind of features two key features that setup and teardown offer to kind of help that kind of workflow. And one is that, like, if let's say that your teardown process fails, well, that might not mean for you that your DAG run should be failed. Maybe you want to ignore that failure for the purpose of evaluating the DAG run state. And so that's how teardowns work by default. They're ignored for DAG run state. So if your query is successful and in the teardown, something goes wrong with like deleting the cluster, your DAG run will still be successful. Of course, you can override that if you want to. And then the other part of it is sort of the clearing behavior, where, like, let's say that the DAG run has completed, you need to rerun some part of it, right? You want to clear this particular task to rerun it. but you can't just clear that particular task because you know that it needs something to be spun up in order to actually complete. And so if you clear a task that requires a setup, the setup will be cleared, and then again the teardown would be cleared too to rerun.
Oh,
And that's kind of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I did not know that. Very cool. That's awesome. So I guess how did you end up working on this feature? And maybe tell us about, hey, how many other people actually had to work did you work with to bring this to life?
Yeah, so this feature was originally authored by Vikram Koka and Ash Berlin Taylor, and I'm on the open source team at Astronomer along with Brent Bavenzi, Ephraim Anarobi, Jed Cunningham, TP Chung, and Raul Vatz. All of us, and there's other people on the team, but these were the sort of core people who were helping to bring AIP 52 to life. Yeah.
Very interesting. Nice. Well, it really does take a village.
Yeah.
And so I remember kind of we were talking about this before, you had two different approaches that you were considering as you thought out how you were going to implement setup and teardown tasks. Would you mind kind of diving into that and maybe explaining to the viewers, hey, what kind of approaches you took and why you ended up settling on the approach that you did?
Right. So the key debate with setup and teardown sort of ended up being, whether it should be setups and teardowns should be thought of as, on the level of the task group or at the level of the task. And to kind of help explain that difference, originally we were going to define it on the task group, and so each task group could have a setup or a teardown, and the setup would be the first thing to run in the task group, the teardown would be the last thing to run in the task group, and you wouldn't set dependencies between the tasks, so no dependencies between setup and work task, or no dependencies between setup and teardown. You would just decorate essentially your, a task flow task, for example, inside of a task group, and it would just that would be enough to signal to Airflow that this task was a setup for this task group. Where we ended up was that setups and teardowns can be for an arbitrary collection of tasks. So, and the cost that we have to pay for that is that you have to set the dependencies between setups and teardowns, and between your regular tasks, just like you have with all of your tasks before. So you still have to do that, yeah. So you have to. You also have to link this. You have to associate the setup with the teardown. So you're telling, when you're defining a setup, a teardown task, you're saying which setups is this teardown for. Usually it's going to be one, but it allows you to set up sort of pairwise setup teardown pairs. And there's no rules about where they can appear in a group. They could be at the, anywhere in the middle. It could be at the end. It doesn't really matter. And you can have as many as you want in a group. There's no constraints with regard to that. So that's where we ended up. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, it really is very flexible in terms of, the amount you can kind of nest in each other, which is great. And so I guess kind of, maybe you could talk about how you ended up with, that task relationships approach. So why you went with, hey, we want to have these relationships explicitly defined rather than, kind of automatically linked where you don't have to.
Yeah. So it started out. So we started out with doing it at the task group level, and then at that time the implementation question was, well, yeah, how do we implement this, right? And there were sort of two main paths. One was so recall that the idea was that we wouldn't have to set dependencies between setups and teardowns, but so the thought was, well, okay, to implement this, maybe we should just add the dependencies, have Airflow add to the dependencies after the DAG parse, and maybe we'd hide them in the UI or something. So we'll just lean in. We'll still lean on on what Airflow is already good at, which is handling when something should schedule based on its upstream downstream relationships and its trigger rules. But we'll hide that from the user to make it a cleaner API. The other the other implementation approach considered was to not add those relationships behind the scenes, but to just change the scheduler so that it would be aware of setups and teardowns and where and when they should be when they should run. And the downside with messing with the scheduler is there's a decent chance of creating some kind of performance regression, and it can be hard to sort of evaluate the impact of your changes at scale with all the crazy things that people who use Airflow end up doing. Yeah, so, but nonetheless, it seemed like that was probably the lesser of two evils in terms of implementing it. But so when we went down that path of customizing the scheduler to know about setups and teardowns, pretty quickly, like there was one sort of big kind of edge case that caused me to sort of rethink whether this might be the right path. And that was, so let's say you have one task in a group. Okay, we'll call it task 2. Okay, task 2 is in a group and it has a setup and a teardown in that group. And then you have task 1 that's outside of the group, but it's upstream of task 2. Okay, and let's suppose that task 1 fails. Okay, well now task 2 should not run, generally speaking, because it's upstream failed, so it shouldn't run. But before we even get to the point where we can evaluate whether task 2 should run, we have to evaluate whether the setup that's attached to the group should run or not. And so you're put into a position where now we have to sorry, I just got slacked. So now we have right. So now we have to we have to evaluate whether let me just quit Slack real quick. Okay. Yeah, so now we have to when we're evaluating whether the setup in that group should run, we have to evaluate based on the tasks in the group. So we have to use the tasks in the group as a proxy sort of for whether the setup for that task group should run. Yeah, so obviously if we marched down that path, we probably could have figured something out, but that gave me just a sort of opportunity to try to take a look at what the other alternative implementation approach was, which was to use the sort of existing upstream downstream dependency framework and trigger rules. And long story short, when we looked at that again, we basically saw that once you sort of added, you could just add a new trigger rule and you kind of unlocked most of the functionality of the AIP. And the trigger rule is as follows. Its effect is basically a teardown should run if its setup was successful and its other upstreams are done. And that once in adding that one kind of gets us most of the way there. Of course, we have to then set the dependencies manually, but once you do that, you can kind of build any kind of setup teardown sort of process that you want to, at least as envisioned in the original AIP. The other stuff like clearing DAG run state, the clearing behavior and affecting or not affecting optionally the DAG run state with teardowns, those were more straightforward to implement. And yeah, so that's the story.
Very cool. Very cool. So I think you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could just kind of explain anything you missed here on additional capabilities that this design choice allowed you to then implement.
Yeah. So it unlocks it unlocked having multiple setups and teardowns in a group because now it's no longer ambiguous which setup is for which teardown and vice versa, that kind of thing. And then by linking the setup and the teardown directly, if you use task flow, you kind of have to do that in order to send data from one task to another. So that became possible, which could be a convenient thing if you're creating a cluster and then you need to tear down that specific cluster. Then you can reference the cluster ID or something and pass that through. Yeah, and then the other thing about task groups is they are there to be used in sort of an arbitrary way, an arbitrary logical grouping, which could be maybe you have your use for them is visual, or it has an association with some kind of business group, or maybe you're using it for mapping by sort of removing the constraints with respect to task groups that frees us to continue to use task groups in the same ways that we already are, but with adding this additional functionality with regard to setups and teardowns. Yeah.
Nice. So I think you touched on this already, but in case there's anything else you want to talk about, just what other things might have informed the way the decision to move away from those automatically assigned dependencies. If there's just anything else you wanted to kind of talk about in that area, please.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is like there was a debate whether we could in the simple case sort of automatically link the setups and teardowns, so that way if you have them, if you sort of just have a setup task in a context, and you have a teardown task in a context, and you have like a normal task in the context, and when I say context, I mean the task group context manager, then you could automatically wire them up in the right way. But the problem is, like, when we start, like, once you if we do that, if we help the user in that way, then it ends up being a little bit inconsistent when you add more tasks, and then now you're forced to set the dependencies between them. So we ended up ruling that out. Yeah.
There you go. Nice. That's very cool. And so I think that covers setup and teardown tasks. Unless there's any other considerations you'd like to share, or any kind of interesting tidbits, around contributing open source software that you'd like to give the community, maybe inspire some of the viewers out there.
Yeah, well, I would just say that contributing to open source for me was definitely a really rewarding experience. I think I definitely got a lot more out of it than I necessarily was giving back, because I was learning so much from, like, all the code review and all that stuff. And it definitely expanded my knowledge about sort of what is possible, like new ways of doing things, better ways of doing things. And I ended up incorporating a lot of that stuff at my day job. So, and it's also giving back to a project that you're getting something out of. And yeah, so I think it's a good thing to do if you have the time to do it. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's a great feedback loop. Hopefully we'll get some new Airflow contributors. So Daniel, I think that is all the time we have today, but I really, really appreciate you coming on, talking about setup and teardown tasks. And I think the viewers did as well. Got some great views today.
Awesome.
So without further ado, signing off. Catch you all here next week, where we'll have another Live with Astronomer. So have a good one, y'all.
Awesome.